So how do we then get access to the concrete value that was entered by the user in the URL? For this, Next.js gives us a special hook we can use. For this, we need to import something from next/router. So from the Next library and there from the router subpackage. And we need to import the useRouter hook. So that's a React hook defined by the Next.js team, which we can use in any functional component. Alternatively, if you're working with class-based components, there also is a withRouter higher order component which you can wrap around your class-based component to get a special router prop injected into your component. But we're using the more modern functional component only approach here, and therefore we will use this useRouter hook. Now, inside of the functional component, we can then call useRouter like this, and this will return a router object to us. Again, if you would be using withRouter, you would be getting that router key here on your props object. Now, what does this router object give us, which we're getting here? This router object exposes various pieces of data and various methods we can use. Now, we'll have a look at the methods later when we dive into navigating between pages, but when it comes to the data properties, we, for example, get the path name. And let's see what's inside of that by simply console logging it here, so that we can see what we get there as a value. And let's also console log something else. Let's console log router.query. That's another interesting property we can access on that router object. With that, if we save this updated project ID page here, if we go to /portfolio/something or anything like that, and we then open up the developer tools, we see the path here. And the interesting thing here is that we don't see the path we entered in the URL /portfolio/something, but the path inferred by Next.js. So the path to the component file that had to be loaded to bring this to the screen, the portfolio folder, and then the square bracket project ID.js file, if you want to read it like this. And that, of course, is the path Next.js had to take to reach this component, which is responsible for what we see here. So that is the encoded, the inferred path Next.js took. Then here we have an empty object, but we can't ignore this double output we're getting here for the moment. Instead, if we have a look at the last log here, we see that it's actually not an empty object, but it is an object with a project ID property and then a value of something. And that's the interesting part now. This query property on the router gives us access to the concrete data that is encoded in the URL. So it gives us access to the concrete value we get for this dynamic path segment. So we entered portfolio/something, and therefore something is the concrete value for this project ID placeholder. And that's why on this query object, we get project ID as a key name, because I picked project ID here as a value between the square brackets. And then something, so what we entered in the URL, as a value. And that means that we can use this router query property to get access to the concrete value encoded in the URL. And if this would be the ID of some database object, we could then send a request to some backend server to fetch the piece of data with an ID of router.query.projectID in this case. That's how we could use this encoded value. And that, of course, is how we will use it later once we also dive into data fetching. Here, I just want you to understand how that routing works and how we can get access to the different pieces of data we might need. And that is how we can get access to this dynamic segment value.